Studied at the American University of Cairo as an undergrad, and when I was there, I wrote a paper on the Yemeni civil war in the 1960s, and I was really fascinated by Yemen, by the place. Cairo was the first time that I'd really studied Arabic, that I'd studied in the Middle East, and while I was there, I also bought a book, which is still my favorite book on Yemen. It's a book by this guy named Tim McIntosh Smith. It's called Yemen, Travels in Dictionary Land. And in my opinion, it's a spectacular book. Tim is a guy who was studying Arabic at the University of Oxford, and he went off to Yemen. He fell in love with the place, as so many of us do who come from the outside and go to Yemen. And in fact, he still lives in Yemen, so he spent over 3 decades in Yemen. And it's essentially this extended love story for Yemen. So reading that book, being interested in the Civil War, meant that it was a place that I really wanted to go. After graduating from college, I was in the Peace Corps in Jordan, and I applied for a Fulbright fellowship, and I thought, well, if I could go to one place, where was the place that I would want to go? And it was Yemen. And so that's sort of how I ended up there. When I was in the Peace Corps, and I was in the Peace Corps on September 11, 2001, so I was in Jordan when September 11 took place, and then I lived out on the Iraqi border in this small village called Safawi, and I was very interested in Yemen at the time. And one of the things that I remember is in November of 2002, there was a U.S. drone strike that killed an individual named Abu Ali al-Qadhi, who was the head of Al-Qaeda in Yemen at the time. And I became very interested in sort of writing about and studying Al-Qaeda in Yemen after that drone strike, because of this drone strike. And that, in fact, is when I first had the idea to write a book on Al-Qaeda in Yemen. That, of course, being 2002. The book has just come out, so it took a decade. It took a long time for me to think about how it was that I wanted to write this book. Obviously, to go to Yemen, to spend time there. But one of the things that's always been very frustrating to me, and I think is frustrating to a lot of people who spend time in the Middle East, is that you have a situation where a lot of people in Washington and a lot of people in the United States comment about Al-Qaeda, but they don't spend very much time on the ground in these particular places. And so one of the things that I saw is that the United States government has been very helpful in really providing a lot of fellowships and a lot of scholarships, whether it was at the University of Arizona when I got money from Title VI, or through a Fulbright fellowship, or through the Peace Corps, that they've done a really great job in helping me to do what it is that I want to do in supporting some of my studies. And when I saw what I felt to be a deficiency in an area working on Al-Qaeda, particularly in Yemen, I felt that it was important to sort of stand up and say what it is that I thought would be the case. And so it's been sort of a secondary research project for me on Yemen. Well, the first time I went was in 2003 as a Fulbright Fellow, and I was there for 12 months. And then I came back, so I was there from 2003 to 2004. And then I came back again in 2005 for several months, and then back again in 2006. And then I went back again in 2009. And then I just took a short trip there this past, just about a month ago, just to check out the political situation, see how things were evolving on the ground, particularly now that that President Hadi is in power. There have been a couple of times where Al-Qaeda has mentioned me in some of their writings. In Sultan Manahem, for instance, that happened. And when I was going to take a trip to Yemen in 2009, I talked to a couple of friends, some who happened to have contacts within Al-Qaeda, and one of them warned me against going. He said, look, Al-Qaeda isn't particularly happy with some of the things that you wrote. You shouldn't come to Yemen. And I thought about this. I talked to some other people and weighed all the sort of the pros and the cons. And eventually I went to Yemen that summer. Didn't have any sort of problem. I mean, I'm just one guy. I don't think Al-Qaeda has a particularly great counterintelligence network that they're able to sort of see everyone who comes inside the country. And so there have been sort of the vague threats that have been like that in the past. But, I mean, you know, Yemen is a very small country. Most people tend to know one another. And so when you spend a lot of time within the country, everyone sort of knows each other's travel plans and who's going where, who's whom, and so forth. And so it's not something that I spend a great deal of time thinking about or worrying about. I mean, those are things that I think tend to distract you from real issues. So the book, The Last Refuge, is a book that I've wanted to write for a long time. In fact, just down the road here is a bookstore, Kramer Books and Afterwards Cafe, and it was there in November 2008. I've been wanting to write the book for about 6 years. I hadn't obviously written it, been thinking about it, but I was browsing in Kramer Books, and it just suddenly, all the pieces sort of fell into place, and I felt, okay, finally I'm ready to write. And I spent the last 4 years writing, and basically it's a story. I didn't want it to be an academic book. I wanted it to tell the story of Al-Qaeda, how it developed in Yemen, sort of the rise of Al-Qaeda, and then the fall after September 11th, how the U.S. defeated it, and then the ultimate resurrection of the organization in Yemen and how it continues to be a threat to the United States today. And so, I mean, there have been a lot of very good books written about Al-Qaeda, about foreign policy since September 11th. Many of these books, however, I feel like they're books about the U.S. They're books about the U.S. in Iraq, or they're books about the U.S. in Afghanistan. And one of the things that I wanted to do was sort of tell the other side of the story. So I wanted to make this more about sort of personalities within Al-Qaeda, as well as the U.S., rather than about policies. Basically, I wanted it to be a book that my mom, who doesn't know Yemen, doesn't really care about Yemen, could read and learn something about. When President Obama was inaugurated for the first time, I was in my apartment in Princeton, New Jersey, and he had campaigned very strongly on closing Guantanamo Bay. And while I was watching the inauguration, I was sort of reading through this pile of Arabic printouts that I had from jihadi websites. One of the printouts that I was reading announced this, what it called this merger between the Yemeni branches and the Saudi branch of Al-Qaeda. And the second line said that a former Guantanamo Bay detainee was now the second in command of this new group, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, what we know as AQAP. And so there's this very sort of strange disconnect where I'm watching the president be inaugurated on television, and yet in my hands I hold this piece of paper which suggested to me at the time that he was not going to be able to fulfill his campaign pledge to close Guantanamo. And of course we know that the president attempted, in fact he signed this, the second piece of legislation that he signed was his intent to close Guantanamo Bay within a year. Of course that did not happen. Largely, I think, because of some of the people like Saeed al-Shihri and Mohammed al-Awfi who'd been in Guantanamo Bay and then were able to rejoin Al-Qaeda, and particularly Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. How successful the president is going to be in his second term is really hard to say. Traditionally, presidents find they have much more flexibility on foreign policy than they do in domestic policy. But Guantanamo Bay is one of those issues that is both a foreign policy issue as well as a domestic policy issue. And if Congress continues to be sort of unwilling to accept Guantanamo prisoners into the U.S. prison system, and if the Obama administration continues to play their cards rather poorly, as we saw with Attorney General Holder in the attempt to try Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in a place like New York, then I'm not particularly optimistic about the U.S. being able to close Guantanamo Bay. And I agree with the New York Times editorial page when they wrote that this is a stain on the justice system of the United States. There's a lot that could be done, but unfortunately I think what we're seeing is that both political parties, instead of working to solve these very difficult issues, are basically using them as a stick to beat each other with. And one of the other problems that we face when we're dealing with Guantanamo is that, I mean, these are people, many of them that were arrested in a bounty hunt more than a decade ago. And the U.S. has just sort of let them sit. And now being able to sift the innocent from the guilty is a task that appears to be beyond sort of the capabilities of the United States. And so, you know, what people like Saeed al-Shihri and Mohammed al-Awfi did is they really put a face to some of the worst fears of people within the United States government, and that is that individuals that the U.S. had once had in custody were now free and threatening to kill Americans again. And so if Saeed al-Shihri is able to carry out an attack that kills Americans, you can imagine the political outcry. This is a guy that the U.S. once had in a prison, or once had in Guantanamo Bay, and now he's carrying out an attack that kills Americans. By my count, in 2012, particularly since President Hadi has come to power, the U.S. has carried out somewhere between 38 and 52 drone strikes by most estimates, including my own. The U.S. says publicly that those 38 to 52 drone strikes are an attempt to kill 10 to 15 individuals, but that's 38 to 52 drone strikes to kill 10 or 15 guys. So to me, that suggests that one of two things is happening. Either the drone strikes aren't as accurate as the U.S. is telling us that they are, or B, that the U.S. is doing something different than just targeting those 10 or 15 individuals. And I think if the U.S. could limit itself to high-value targets against those 10 to 15 individuals, it would not only do a great job in sort of reducing the leadership capabilities of Al-Qaeda, but it would also eliminate and significantly reduce civilian casualties, which then would mean that instead of Al-Qaeda growing so quickly as we've seen over the past 3 years, Al-Qaeda's recruits would actually start to dry up. The U.S. is primarily concerned about Yemen because of terrorism. It's sad, but it's true. The U.S. doesn't appear to care about much that happens in Yemen with the exception of terrorism. So the U.S. is always going to view Yemen through a counterterrorism lens. It's always going to be concerned about Yemen because of the threat of a terrorism attack taking place. Now, one of the interesting things for me is how this discussion takes place in the U.S. and how it takes place in Yemen. And I think what takes place in the U.S. is that many of the people we're essentially having a debate about technology and about the legality and the ethics of using drones. Whereas in Yemen, I think the discussion is much more focused on civilian casualties. So I don't think that Yemenis themselves care a great deal whether an attack's being carried out by a drone, or whether it's being carried out by an airplane, or whether it's being carried out by a ship that's off the coast of Yemen. What they know is that Yemenis who aren't involved in Al-Qaeda are dying. One of the things that I'm concerned about is the different types of drone strikes that the U.S. carries out within Yemen. So there are what the U.S. calls high-value targets, which they strike at, which the U.S. usually, this is, say, the target that killed Fahd al-Qussa in early 2012, or the one that killed Anwar al-Awlaki in late 2011. The U.S. has a particular piece of intelligence, and it knows who it is that it's firing the missile at. But then there are also strikes that are known as signature strikes or terrorist attack disruption strikes that the U.S. is carrying out without necessarily knowing the identities of people on the ground. And what I would like to see is the U.S. sort of cut signature strikes and terrorist attack disruption strikes out of their, they would eliminate that option. Because the U.S., the U.S. is not going to quit using drones in Yemen. This is an amazing piece of technology that the U.S. has, that Al-Qaeda doesn't have. This is something that allows the U.S. to do things that it couldn't have done in the past. So this is a very powerful counterterrorism tool. However, I think the problem that the U.S. has is by overusing this tool, they've got into a position where instead of making the situation better, instead of sort of disrupting, dismantling, and defeating Al-Qaeda, as President Obama continually says that he wants to do, what's actually taking place is that they're exacerbating the problem of Al-Qaeda in Yemen and actually expanding the network. And I think by using drones less, by using drones more judiciously, and by only using drones for high-value target strikes, that the U.S. has very solid on-the-ground intelligence, that the U.S. would eliminate, or at least go a long way towards reducing civilian casualties, which would not only help the U.S. and the Yemeni government in sort of killing the Al-Qaeda leaders that are targeting the United States, but would also then remove the radicalizing effect that civilian casualties have. I mean, both you and I know that Al-Qaeda is not very popular in Yemen. The problem is when the U.S. becomes less popular than Al-Qaeda, and when the U.S. is killing people and driving people into the arms of Al-Qaeda. In the book, there are scenes where people who didn't know where Afghanistan was and yet they hear about these horrible atrocities that the Soviet army is carrying out in the 1980s, and so they're driven to tears and then eventually driven to action and want to go off and fight Al-Qaeda, fight the Soviets with the Mujahideen that are in Afghanistan. I think that's changed a little bit today, in that because of not only the media, but because of sort of media penetration into Yemen, most members of Al-Qaeda today are more politically savvy about what the U.S. is doing in places like Yemen, but also they're just more aware of some of the politics. So, in fact, Al-Qaeda has recently put out two different things on some jihadi forums. Al-Madad put out issue 26 of its little newsletter, and they're talking about Adnan Latif, the guy who died in Guantanamo Bay, the Yemeni detainee there. They're talking about U.S. Marines being landed in Yemen. And so this is certainly the politics, particularly the local politics, is something that Al-Qaeda fighters are well aware of today. And I think there's another thing at play here, and that is that the name Al-Qaeda, I think, is very... It's incredibly unpopular in Yemen because of all of those sakes, because of the Muslim civilian casualties that have died over the past decade. But Al-Qaeda members themselves, I think as individuals, the groups in which they sort of interact with, that they tend to be known as very pious, very good and honorable people. That is, they conduct themselves by the rules of the game within Yemen. They know Urf, they know the tribal law, they know Sharia, they're able to talk in a language that sounds very good in Yemen. I know that we've seen different things. For instance, Sadr Malahem, the magazine that Al-Qaeda put out for quite a long time, it seems to have sort of died off, or at least they haven't put anything out in recent months. There was often at least one article, sometimes two articles, that were written by women, and Al-Qaeda would talk about the different roles that women could play in the organization. In fact, Nasser al-Wahayshi and Qassam al-Raimi and Fawaz al-Rabi'i, these are the individuals who broke out of prison in February of 2006, and in fact, for me, this is sort of the genesis moment of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. After September 11th, Al-Qaeda had sort of been defeated, and then they have this prison break, and that's really how the group is able to resurrect itself up from the ashes. And in the day after these individuals escaped from prison, it was actually a Yemeni woman there in Sana'a who gave them protection, who hid them in her house when the police were looking for all of these escaped prisoners. But the U.S. is certainly concerned about women coming from Al-Qaeda. You know, obviously one of the major concerns that the Obama administration has is that there's going to be a terrorist attack in the United States that can be traced back to Yemen. And they're thinking about all different ways that this can happen, whether somebody with a Western passport, an American citizen, or a Western citizen of a Western country. And they're also worried about women because it tends to be the men who are given the most attention when it comes to security screens. For instance, every time I come back from Yemen, I end up in the back room and have a very long interrogation, a very long conversation with security officers who are quite concerned about what it is that I was doing in Yemen, why I was there, and so forth. But we also know, or at least we think we know, that some of these women, that Nasr al-Wahayshi, the commander of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, has at least been quoted as saying that he doesn't want women to carry out any attacks. Now, how true that is hard to say. Whether this is something that he's just saying in the hopes of throwing Americans off the scent is again impossible to know. But at least those are the quotations that we have, is that there are roles for women within Al-Qaeda to play, but that at the moment Wahayshi doesn't want them carrying out, say, suicide attacks or anything of that nature. There's a frustration from U.S. leaders and U.S. policymakers, and they feel as though they do a very good job about, say, eliminating Al-Qaeda in one place or eliminating one version of Al-Qaeda, but then the organization sort of morphs and evolves and changes, and it becomes another security threat in a different place. So I think that Al-Qaeda can be defeated, and I think it can be decisively defeated, but the very real but unspoken assumption, I think, that takes place somewhere like Washington is that the U.S. can defeat Al-Qaeda on its own. I mean, this is a very American attitude. You have a problem we'll work harder, we'll do a better job, we'll throw more money, we'll throw more individuals at the problem, and we'll be able to defeat it. And I don't think that that can actually work. It can't be the U.S. against Al-Qaeda in Yemen. It has to be Yemen against Al-Qaeda. And the U.S. can do a number of things to not only assist the Yemeni government, but also assist Yemeni tribesmen, assist Yemeni clerics, assist the people in Yemen in standing up and defeating Al-Qaeda. We know that when Al-Qaeda was driven out of places like Abiyan and out of Shebwa, that it was popular committees, that it was Yemeni tribesmen, and that it was Yemeni clerics who are standing up to Al-Qaeda. And I think that the U.S. has made a number of mistakes in recent years that make this more difficult than it necessarily has to be. I think it's gotten to the point. I'm very interested in the history of Yemen. Obviously, I want to write the dissertation, which is on the Yemeni civil war in the 1960s, and there are a couple other big projects that I think would be very fascinating. For instance, writing a biography of the Hamdani imams and talking about the development of North Yemen through sort of a four-person biography through, Imam al-Mansur, going through Yahya, and then Ahmed, and then Muhammad al-Badr. I think that would be very, very fascinating. But at the same time, I think I've gotten to the point where, particularly when it comes to U.S. policy and U.S. politics in Yemen, that maybe the utility of what it is that I have to say, it might be time for someone else to sort of make some of the arguments, because I think that at this point it's largely known when I open my mouth what it is that I'm going to say. And so some of the novelty, I think, has worn off at this point. So we'll see. Yemen is a place that I love, a place that I've been traveling to for almost a decade. I have plans to go back, and it's hard to imagine that I would do something that doesn't involve or relate to Yemen, and yet one never really knows the future.